The old one was already kneeling in the snow when I crossed the threshold of his fire, and I had come to kill him. I want that understood before anything else, because the young of my line tell this story now with the killing sanded off, and they are wrong to do it. I did not come to the way station at Drennhollow to be loved. I came down off the white ridge on a night when the cold cracked the rocks, with my ribs showing through my winter coat and 3 of my pups dead behind me in the den, and the last two too weak to follow. I came for the meat smell that bled out of the man's chimney. I came to take whatever lived inside that low stone house and feed it to my children, and if the thing inside fought, I meant to open it from throat to belly and let it cool in the drifts. I am Vale. We are not the small soft creatures the keeper's tales have made of us. A grown sire of my kind stands as high at the shoulder as a man's chest, and we run a winter coat the color of old iron, and our jaws close on a draft beast's leg bone and shear it like a green reed. The frontier folk called us drennhounds, which is their word, not ours, and they were right to bar their doors when the wind carried our calling. We had taken their stock for 9 generations of their kind. We had taken 3 of their children too in the lean years, and I will not lie about that to make myself gentler than I was. I was hungry, and I was an apex of a starved range, and the man at the fire was prey. So I want it written plainly in the way they keep their records. I, who am called Ashthroat now, and was called nothing then, came to Harnolek's door to kill and eat him. That is where the story starts. Everything the keepers carved into their courtyard stone after, every line of their warm ration law, every drennhound that now lies across a sleeping child's feet on the cold worlds. All of it grew from a night that began with murder in my chest. I came in low along the lee of the storehouse, where the drifts had piled to the eaves and the wind could not find me. The man's fire threw an orange seam under his door. I could hear him moving inside, the slow shuffle of an old creature, a kettle scraped off a hook, the small private cough of a body that has lived too long in the cold. Easy, slow, half-blind in the dark, I judged, by the way he found his furniture with his hands. I had killed faster, stronger things. I gathered myself under the eave, and I came around the corner of the storehouse into the open yard, and I stopped. Because the man had come out. He was standing in his doorway with the firelight behind him, a great gray-bearded shape in a coat sewn of patched hides, and he was not looking at me with the eyes of prey. He was looking at me the way another old hunter looks at a thing he has been expecting. He had a long iron in his hand, a fire poker, I learned later, not a gun, and he did not raise it. He set the butt of it down in the snow and leaned on it like a staff, and he looked at the wreck of me standing in his yard, at my showing ribs and my crusted coat and the killing in my eyes, and he did the thing that no creature in 9 generations of my line had ever done, to avail at the door. He sighed, as though I were a chore. Well, he said in the low gravel of his speech, words I did not yet have, but came to keep, you've come a long way to be that thin. I should have taken him then. He was within a lunge. He was old and slow, and his blood smell was thin with age, and his bad hip was set wrong under him. I could read all of it from where I stood, the whole soft, easy map of how to end him, and I did not move. I have asked myself across all the winter since why I did not move, and the truest answer I have is this: prey runs or prey freezes or prey fights, and he did none of the 3. He stood in the cold in front of a starved apex, and he was put out, mildly, the way a man is put out by weather, and a thing in the oldest part of me, the part that ranks the world into things above and things below, stuttered and could not place him, and while it stuttered, he turned his back on me. He turned his back on me and shuffled inside, leaving the door open, and the heat and the meat smell rolled out across the yard, and over his shoulder he said the thing that I have carried longer than I have carried my own name. Come in or don't. I'm not heating the whole valley for your manners. I did not go in, not that night. I want that on the record too, because the young tell it as though I walked in and lay down at his feet, and that is a lie that cheapens what was real. I was not tamed. I have never in my life been tamed. What happened across that first winter was slower and harder and stranger than taming, and it started when the old man, having turned his back on a thing that could have unzipped his spine, set a flat stone just outside his threshold in the spill of his firelight, and put on it a haunch of salted draft meat, and went to his bed and slept while I stood in his yard and shook with hunger and rage and a confusion I had no den word for. I ate the meat. Of course I ate the meat. I was starving and my pups were dying, and pride is a thing for full bellies. I ate it where it lay, and I watched the dark doorway the whole time for the trick, the snare, the gun, and the trick never came. Then I took the bone, there was good marrow in it, back up the white ridge to my den, and I cracked it open with my back teeth, and I fed the marrow to the 2 pups who still drew breath, working it into their mouths with my tongue, and they lived through the night. Both of them. The first of mine to live through a night in a long time. That was the whole of it, the first night. A man too tired to be afraid, a stone, a haunch, a bone carried uphill. There was no doctrine in it yet. The keepers would put the doctrine in later. They cannot help themselves, those people. They take a kindness and they build a temple on it. But on the night itself, there was only the meat smell and the open door and a hungry monster in the snow who could not understand why the food was not poisoned. I went back the next night. I told myself it was for the meat, and it was, but it was also for the puzzle of him, which had got into me the way a thorn gets into a pad, small, and impossible to leave alone. The stone had meat on it again. This time he was in the doorway when I came, sitting now on a low stool, with a clay cup steaming in his two hands, and he watched me cross the yard with that same put-upon patience, and when I lowered my head to the stone, he said, "Slower, you'll cramp," as if I cared for his counsel. As if I were a green pup gulping its first kill, I bared my teeth at him, a warning, a true one, the kind that empties a clearing. And he blew across the top of his cup and did not so much as blink. "There it is," he said. "Big talk. Eat your supper." I ate my supper. This is the part the keepers never understand, even now, even the wise ones. They think the wonder of it was that a beast learned to love a man. That is not the wonder. The wonder was that the man was not impressed by me. Every other creature that had ever stood in my presence had ranked itself below me. The prey ran, the lesser predators yielded the kill, the frontier folk barred their doors and prayed. I had spent my whole life being the most dangerous thing in any clearing I entered, and I had built my whole self out of that fact. And here was a soft, slow, half-blind old man who looked at the most dangerous thing in the valley and saw a problem he was too tired to be bothered by, and the floor fell out of the world. I did not have words then. I have them now, his words, kept the way we keep a scent trail, and I will use them to tell it true. But that winter I had only the puzzle and the meat, and the slow narrowing of the distance between his fire and the place in the yard where I would let myself stand. His name, I would learn, was Harnolek, and he was the keeper of the Drennhollow waystation, which was the last roof place on the high trail before the pass, and his work was to keep the fire lit and the well unfrozen, and the trail markers clear, so that the haulers and the down valley folk who crossed the high country in the cold months would have somewhere to not die. He had done it 40 years. He had done it alone the last 11, since his partner went under the ice on the long tarn and did not come up, and Harn had hauled the body out himself and buried it in the one soft patch of ground behind the storehouse and gone back to keeping the fire, because the fire does not care who is sad. He was old now, even by his own people's count, and his hip was bad and his eyes were going, and the syndicate down in the river town had sent him 3 letters that winter telling him the waystation was to be closed and sold, and that he was to come down and be old somewhere out of their way. He had not answered the letters. He had fed them to the fire. I watched him do it, the 3rd one, from my place in the yard, watched him hold the paper to the flame and read it once by its own burning light and then let it go. And the contempt in the set of his shoulders was a thing I understood perfectly, in my bones, without a single word. It was the contempt of an old territory holder for a young challenger who has sent a messenger instead of coming himself. I had felt it. I felt it now on his behalf, and that was the first night I lay down. Not at his feet, I want that kept exact, but in the yard, in the lee of the storehouse, in the spill of his firelight, with my back to him and my eyes on the dark trail down which his enemies would have to come. I told myself it was warm there. It was warm there. But I have lain in many warm places in my life, and I have only ever guarded one of them. The pups came down off the ridge in the middle of that winter, and that is where the trouble with the man's own kind began. I had not meant to bring them. A den is a den. You do not move grown enough young into the open, into the smell of man, into the reach of his irons. But the ridge den had gone bad. The snow above it had come loose in a thaw and freeze and packed the entry to a foot of ice I could not break, and the 2 of them, my last 2, were past the age where they would wait quiet in the cold while I worked. They followed me down. I came over the lip of the yard one black morning with the meat smell pulling me, and I heard the soft crunch of their feet behind me in the crust, and I turned and they were there, ears flat, bellies low, terrified of the open and following me anyway because I was all they had. Harn was at the well breaking the morning ice. He straightened slow, a hand to his bad hip, and he saw me, and then he saw the 2 small iron-gray shapes at my flank, and I went still all over because this was the moment. This was where the man's kind always changed. A lone monster a man can pity from his doorway, a breeding pair of monsters with young on his ground, by his well. That is a thing the frontier folk kill, and rightly, by their lights. I lowered my head and I put my body between him and the pups, and I waited to learn what he was under the patience. He looked at the pups a long time. Then he looked at me. Then he said to the pups, not to me, "Well, you're not much, are you?" And he tossed the heel of bread he'd had in his coat pocket out onto the snow halfway between us, and he went back to breaking the well ice, as though 3 drennhounds in his yard were the day's weather and not the day's death. The braver pup, The female, the one the keepers would later make so many tales of, went for the bread. Of course she did. She was starving and young and stupid with it. She bellied across the snow and snatched it and bolted back to me, and Harn did not even turn around. And something in me that had been wound tight for the man's whole kind for 9 generations eased by a single turn. Not all the way, but one turn. That was the winter she got into the firehouse. I tell this part because the keepers tell it wrong, and because it is the true root of the thing they later carved in stone, and I was there and they were not. There was a low shed off the side of the main house where Harn kept the season's salted meat and the firewood and the things that must not freeze, and the door of it did not latch true. And on a night when the cold came down so hard that even I brought the pups in under the eave, the female worked the door with her nose and her paw the way young Vale work everything, out of boredom and hunger and the deep need to put their mouths on the world, and she got inside and she found the salt meat. She did not eat it. That is the part that matters. A grown Vale, starved, would have eaten it. I would have eaten it. But she was a pup raised that winter on a man's thrown bread and a man's patience, and she had watched every night the thing the old man did that I had not yet understood. And what she did with the salt meat was she dragged it, haunch by haunch, out of the shed and across the snow and laid it on the flat feeding stone outside his door, all of it. She emptied his winter larder onto his own threshold stone in the dark, and then she lay down beside it and waited the way she had watched me wait, the way she had watched him set out food for a starving thing and step back. She was feeding the old man. She had seen him do it for me, night after night, set the meat on the stone, step back, let the hungry thing eat in peace, and her small mind had taken that to be what one does. For one's own, you find the meat, you carry it to the stone, you lay it down for the one who keeps the fire. She had no word for hunger in others. She only had the shape of the thing he did, and she did it back. Harn found it at dawn, his whole winter's salt meat, dragged out into the snow and freezing solid on his doorstep, and the pup curled beside it half-frozen herself, guarding it, lifting her head to watch him come. A lesser man would have seen ruin, a season's food spoiled, the work of a beast that had to be put down before it cost him his life. I watched from the yard with my heart gone to stone, ready, the killing back in me cold and clear, because if he raised an iron to her, I was going to take his arm off at the shoulder, and I had already chosen which shoulder. He did not raise an iron. He stood in his doorway, and he looked at the meat, and he looked at the pup, and his old face did a thing I had not seen it do. It folded around the eyes, and his breath came out of him in a long white cloud, and he lowered himself down onto his bad hip in the snow beside her, slow with a grunt, and he put one big scarred hand flat on the ground near her, not touching, just near, and he said in a voice gone rough, "You brought me supper." The pup thumped her tail once against the snow. "You daft little monster," Harn said, and there was water in his old eyes, and he laughed. A cracked, unused sound. "You brought me supper." He kept it, that is the thing. He did not waste it, and he did not scold her. He hauled every haunch of that frozen salt meat back into the shed with his own bad hip slowness, and that night he cooked some of it, and when it was hot he carried a portion out to the stone and set it down. But he set down 2 portions, that night, side by side, one for me and one for her, and he sat on his stool in the doorway with his own bowl, and he ate where we could see him eat, the 3 of us in a rough line in the firelight, and the second pup, the male, crept down out of the yard shadow to the edge of the light, and Harn set down a 4th bowl without a word. We ate together. I had been alive a long time, and I had never in my life eaten in the open beside another creature's fire without one of us meaning to kill the other. The wind came down off the pass and went around the storehouse and could not find us, and the old man ate his supper, and the pups gnawed theirs, and I lay with my chin on my paws and watched the dark trail, and that was the night I stopped telling myself it was only for the meat. It is a small thing to a man's kind, perhaps, sharing out a bowl, but understand what it was to me. In all the world I had ever known, food was the thing you fought over. Food was rank-made flesh. The strongest ate first and most, and the weak ate the leavings or did not eat, and that law was as old as my line and older. And here was an old half-blind creature who, having less food now because of us, having actually lost a portion of his winter to a pup's foolishness, responded by sharing it out more widely. He made the circle bigger when he had less. There was no law in my world that allowed for that. He was breaking a law of the universe on his own doorstep and calling it supper. The keepers, when they finally came, would call this the warm ration law, and they would carve it in the courtyard stone of the trail temple they built, and the line of it reads, in their high speech, "In the cold, the strong feed the weak first, and the circle is widened, not closed." They put it in the voice of doctrine, in the voice of something handed down from on high, with rites and a feeding stone and a procession of grown drennhounds laying meat at the keepers' feet on the longest night. But I was there, and I will tell you what the warm ration law actually was. It was a tired old man too stubborn to be afraid, who would rather share a small supper with the monsters in his yard than eat a larger one alone. That is all it ever was. They built the temple on it because they could not believe a thing so plain could be the root of a thing so strong, and they were wrong. And they have always been wrong, and I have lived long enough now to be the last one who remembers it plain. The trouble, when it came, did not come from the cold or from the dark trail I watched every night. It came down that trail on the backs of crawler sleds, with the syndicate's mark on their flanks, in the thin gray light of the worst stretch of the winter. And it came, as the man's troubles always seem to, wearing the face of business. The deep of that first winter is where the keepers do their worst inventing, and where I most want the record kept straight, because it is the part they have turned into 100 soft little parables, and it was not soft at all. It was a starving monster and a stubborn old man learning, across a long dark season, the exact shape of a thing neither of their kinds had a word for. I will give it to you in the moments that were real, the way I have kept them, scent and sound, and the slow narrowing of the distance to his fire, and you will see, if you are honest, that there was a knife edge under every one of them. There was the night the storm came down so hard the world went white inside an arm's length, the kind of blow that buries a den and freezes a careless thing where it stands, and I brought the pups in close under the storehouse eave and lay over them, and the cold reached even there and got into our bones, and I knew with the old clear knowing of my kind that if it did not break by dawn the smaller pup would not see the light, and the door opened. Harn came out into the white with a hide in his arms, a great heavy draft beast hide, worth more than a season's wage to a man that poor, and he did not try to bring us in, because he had learned by then that I would not put my pups into a man's walls where the door could close behind them. He understood the line, the same way I had come to understand his, so he did not cross it. He laid the hide down in the lee under the eave over us, tucking it with his stiff hands around the pups where they shivered against my flank, and he stayed out there in the killing wind longer than an old man should to be sure it held. And he said nothing, and he went back inside, and the small pup lived because a man gave up his own warmth to a thing that had come to eat him. I did not understand it as kindness. I want that exact. I understood it that night as the most baffling display of dominance I had ever witnessed, for in my world, to give your warmth away is to weaken yourself before arrival, and only the most secure apex of a range could afford to do it, could afford to strip himself for a starving competitor's young and turn his back and sleep. He was either the strongest thing I had ever met or the most foolish, and I lay awake in the warm of his given hide trying to decide which. And somewhere before dawn I understood that with him the two were the same thing. His strength was the foolishness. He was strong enough to be that foolish. There was no other creature on the range that could have lain down to sleep that night with 3 drennhounds under its eave and the wind howling and no fear in it at all. There was the morning I brought him a kill. I had gone up the ridge in a clear cold dawn and run down a snow hare, the first good hunting in weeks, and I ate part of it, the way the strong eat first, and then I stopped with the rest of it warm in my jaws, and I thought of the flat stone by his door, and the meat he set on it, and the long line of nights he had set it there asking nothing back. And a thing turned in me that had never turned in any veil before, so far as my line's memory runs. I carried the rest of the hare down to the hollow, and I laid it on the feeding stone, his stone, in the morning light, and I stepped back, the way he stepped back, and I lay down in the yard and waited. He came out and found it. A snow hare, fresh killed, half of it, laid on his own feeding stone by a thing that 3 months before had come to open him from throat to belly. He stood in the door a long time. Then he came out slow, and he crouched by the stone on his bad hip, and he picked the hare up and turned it in his hands, and he looked over at me where I lay watching, and his old face did the folding thing it had done over the pup in the larder, and he said, "Lo, well, look at you," just that. And he took the hare inside and cooked it, and that night when he set the meat on the stone, there was a portion of my own hair in it. Cooked, given back, the circle widened again. The gift returned with interest, and I understood, eating the hare I had brought him handed back to me warmed by his fire, that we had made a thing between us that had no name and no end, a thing that only got larger the more it was used. That is the warm ration law the keepers could not see for the temple they built on it. Not a right of one giving and one receiving, but a circle that widens each time it turns, the gift coming back larger, the warmth shared out further, until a starved monster and a lonely old man between them had built, out of nothing but thrown bread and given hides and a hare carried downhill, a thing wide enough and warm enough to take in a whole high country. And there was the night. This one the keepers found out about somehow and made the most foolish parable of all, when the pups discovered the old man's habit of warming his hands. It was a small thing he did, an old creature's habit. Each night before he slept, he would crouch at the open fire and hold his two scarred hands out flat to the flame and turn them, slow front and back, warming the blood back into the stiff old fingers, and then he would press his warm palms to his bad hip, where the cold lived, and sigh, nothing. A man easing an old body toward sleep. But the female pup watched him do it every night, the way she watched everything. And one night I saw her by the fire hold out her own great forepaws toward the flame, flat, the way he held his hands, and turned them slow, front and back, warming them. Because that was the thing one did at the fire before sleep. She had seen the keeper do it. It was clearly the proper way of the den. And then she pressed one warm paw against her brother's flank, where he lay, the way the old man pressed his palms to his hip, giving the warmth on, sharing it down the line, and the brother, not to be left out of a den custom, held his own paws to the fire and warmed them and pressed them to mine. So we sat, the four of us, on a deep winter night, in a rough circle at the old man's fire, each one of us warming our hands and paws at the flame and pressing the warmth, the next, a chain of it going round, because a foolish pup had decided that this was how a den keeps the cold out. Not each one warming only itself, but each one warming itself and passing it on, and the old man watched us do it, his whole foolish, dangerous den, holding its paws to his fire and sharing the heat around the circle. And he laughed until the water ran down into his beard, and he said, "You daft creatures, you beautiful daft creatures." And he held his own hands out to the flame and pressed his warmed palm, that night, not to his own hip, to the female's silvering muzzle, passing it on, joining the chain. The keepers heard of this somehow years later from a hauler who'd wintered over and seen it. The pack and the keeper warming their hands at the fire and passing the heat round the circle, and they made it a rite too, and they have a name for it now in their temple, a solemn doctrinal name. And on the longest night, they hold their warmed hands out to the feeding stone fire and press them to the drennhound beside them and weep at the ancientness of it. There is nothing ancient about it. I was there. It was a pup imitating an old man's stiff fingers, and a den deciding that warmth, like meat, is a thing you do not keep but pass along. That is all our laws have ever been. The plain warm things a tired old man did at his fire, watched and copied and carried on by creatures who loved him and had decided without ever being asked that his way was the way of the den. There were 4 of them on the first sled, and the one who did the talking had soft hands and a fur collar and a smell on him of warm rooms and clean. Money, and his name, I would hear it said many times that day, was Vec, a factor of the coil outfit, which held the river town and most of the high trade and wanted now the high trail too. I had gone up into the rocks above the yard when I heard the engines, the pups with me, low and still. This is the way of it. When the man's kind comes in numbers, you do not stand in the open and let them count you. You watch from the high ground, and you learn the shape of the threat before you let it learn yours. So I lay in the rocks with my 2 half-grown pups pressed warm against my flanks, and I watched Vec climb down off his sled in his fine collar and pick his way across the yard he meant to take, and I learned him. Harn came out to meet him, slow, leaning on the fire poker the way he met everything. "You didn't answer the letters," Vec said. Pleasant. The pleasantness of a man who holds all the cards and enjoys laying them down one at a time. 3 letters, keeper. The hollows bought. Whole high trail, well to pass, on the new charter. You're to come down. Trail's not yours to buy, Harn said. Trail's a public way. Has been since before your outfit had a name. Charters change, Vec said, and he smiled, and he held out a folded paper with a heavy seal on it, and when Harn did not take it, he let it hang there a moment, and then tucked it back into his fine coat, unbothered. There's a closing stipend for the keeper, generous, given your age. There's a wagon comes up in 3 days to haul you and your goods down to Rivertown, where there's a warm room and a cot in the almshouse with your name already on the door. You'll thank us by spring. Nobody your age should be wintering this high. It was, I have come to understand, a thing his kind does, to wrap a theft in a kindness, to take a man's whole life out from under him and call it doing him a favor. I had no word for it then, but I had the smell of it, which is the same on every range and in every species. The smell of a strong thing that has decided a weaker thing's territory is forfeit and has come to collect, and wants the weaker thing to thank it for the collecting. Harn did not thank him. Harn looked at the paper shape vanishing into Vec's fine coat, and he said, 40 years I've kept this fire, 11 of them alone. You know how many haulers have come off that pass half dead in a whiteout and found my light still burning? You know how many would have gone under if the hollow was dark? The company will maintain an automated shelter beacon, Vec said. And the words sat wrong in his mouth, a thing he'd been given to say. Solar mast ration locker distress relay. No keeper needed. It's progress. Old man. It's cheaper, and it doesn't get old, and it doesn't get stubborn. He said the last word kindly, which was the cruelest way to say it. And then the female pup beside me in the rocks made a sound. It was nothing, a low thing in her chest, the sound a young veil makes when it does not like a stranger's smell. But it carried in the cold, the way sound does, and Vec's head came up, and his soft city eyes went to the rocks, and one of his men, a hard-faced fellow with a long gun slung at his back, followed the look and saw us, saw 3 iron-gray shapes against the gray stone, 3 sets of pale eyes, and the man's whole body changed. And he had the gun off his shoulder and half up before Harn's voice cut across the yard like a dropped axe. "Don't." The gun stopped. "That's drennhounds," the hard-faced man said, low, not taking his eyes off us. "Factor, that's a breeding pair and young, right on the ground here. They've had this whole valley for stock loss 9 years running. There's a bounty on them in 3 towns." He wet his lips. "We get those. The trip pays for itself twice over. Coats like that off a grown pair." "You'll not fire on my ground," Harn said. "They're vermin, keeper," the man said, and now there was an ugliness coming up in him. The ugliness of a hunter who has been shown rich prey and told he may not take it. "They're a public danger and a paying hide. You've been feeding them? You've been up here feeding drennhounds?" He laughed, an unkind sound, and turned to Vec. "There's your reason the hollow has to close, Factor. Old man's gone soft in the head, feeding monsters, letting them whelp in the yard. He's a danger to every hauler on the trail. Write that in the report." I lay in the rocks and I felt the killing come up in me, cold and clean, the old clear killing, and I marked the hard-faced man with the gun, and I marked the line he would have to cross to reach Harn, and I gathered myself. I would have taken him first. I had already chosen. But Harn did a thing. He walked, slow on his bad hip, straight out into the open middle of the yard, between the men and the rocks, between the guns and my pups, and he turned his back on the men, and he looked up at the rocks where we hid, and he said, in the same low gravel he used to tell me to eat slower, to not cramp the same private voice, he said, "Come on down then, all 3 of you. It's all right." And every man in that yard watched, frozen, as a grown drennhound sire and 2 half-grown pups came down out of the rocks at an old man's word and crossed the open snow to him and stood at his side. And as he set one big scarred hand on the female pup's iron-gray head, "Easy, the way you'd touch a thing that was yours." I want to be exact about what I felt coming down. It was not love, not in that moment. It was rank. He had called, and I had measured the call against the threat, and I had judged that my place, the place where I could do the most killing if the killing came, was at his side in the open in front of the guns, where every man could see that the monsters of Dren Hollow stood with the keeper and not against him. I came down to be a wall. The love had been growing all winter, slow, under the meat and the puzzle of him, but in that one moment it was clean, cold strategy, and I put myself where a strong thing puts itself when its territory is threatened. Between the threat and the thing it will not lose. The hard-faced man with the gun took a step back. I saw it. So did Harn, so did Vec. A grown sire veil at full height, ribs no longer showing now, 6 weeks of a kept fire's leavings put back on the frame, hackles up, eyes on the gun hand and nowhere else. And the man with the long gun, who had been so eager a moment before, took a step back in the snow and did not finish raising it. "There's 4 of you," Harn said, conversational, to the yard at large, not raising his voice. "And there's me and there's them. You do your sums, Factor. You came up here to move one old man off a stipend. You didn't come up here to fight a breeding pair on their own ground in the deep cold with the light going." He let that sit. "You want to talk about who's a danger on this trail, you go ahead and fire that gun, and you find out which of us the danger was." Vec's soft face had gone still. He was not a brave man. I had his smell, and there was no bravery in it, but he was a clever one, and he was doing the sums, and the sums did not come out the way he'd planned when he'd put on his fine collar that morning. 4 men, one a coward in fine fur against an old apex keeper and his pack, with night coming and the sled engines cold. He raised one soft hand and pressed it down through the air, slow, the gesture a man makes to put a kettle off the boil. "Stand it down," he said to the hard-faced man. "Factor, stand it down." And then to Harn, with the pleasantness back on but thinner now, stretched over something else. 3 days, keeper. The wagon comes in 3 days. You and your menagerie can be gone, or you can be a problem the company solves a different way. We're a patient outfit. We're not a forgiving one." He climbed back up onto his sled, fastidious, brushing snow from his fine coat. "Enjoy your fire while you've got it." The sleds turned and went back down the trail into the gray, and the sound of them faded, and the yard was quiet again. And Harnolek stood in the middle of it with his hands still resting on the female pup's head. And I watched the strength go out of him all at once now that the men were gone. Watched his shoulders come down, his weight go hard onto the poker, the old white breath shudder out of him. He had not been unafraid in the yard. I understood that now. He had been afraid the whole time, and he had walked out in front of the guns anyway, and turned his back on them, and called us down. He had been a wall, too, for us. 3 days, he said to no one, to the cold. He looked down at the pup under his hand. "Well, we'll see." I did not know yet what he meant. I know now. And the keepers, when they carved the courtyard stone, left this part out entirely because it did not fit the shape of doctrine. But I was there, and I will not leave it out. An old man, given 3 days to abandon his fire or be destroyed, chose that night neither. He chose to dig in. And the first I knew of it was the sound, after dark, of him in the storehouse, hauling something heavy across the floor. And when I went to the door and looked in, he was bent over an old long gun, oiled and wrapped in hide that he had not touched, I would learn, since the day he pulled his partner out from under the ice. He did not mean to use the gun on the men. I want that clear, because it matters to what he was. He meant it for the pass. I learned his plan slow, across those 3 days, in the way I learned everything about him, by watching the shape of what he did and fitting my understanding to it after. The first day he spent at the storehouse and the trail markers, and I could not read it. The second day, I read it. He was making the hollow into a place that could not be quietly closed. Here is the thing the syndicate had counted on, and the thing Harn meant to take away from them. A way station closes quietly, or it does not close at all. If the keeper goes down meek on the wagon, and the light goes dark, and a season later some hauler freezes in the gap where the fire used to be, that is a sad thing, an unfortunate thing, the kind of thing a clever factor writes up as the unforeseeable risk of the high country, and forgets spring. But if the keeper does not go, if the light stays lit, if word goes down the trail and along the river that the old man at Drennhollow is still keeping the fire against the company's order, and that the haulers still have somewhere to not die, then the closing is not quiet anymore. Then it is a thing people argue about in the river town. Then the coil outfit cannot simply let the dark do its work. They have to come up and put the fire out themselves in front of witnesses, and that they did not want to do, because a strong thing's whole power is in not having to be seen doing the cruel part. So Harn dug in to make them be seen. He went up the trail toward the pass on the second day slow, the bad hip, the long gun across his back not to fire but as a walking staff and a thing to lean on, and he reset every trail marker the winter had knocked flat. And he repainted the distance blazes on the rocks with a pot of warm pitch so they'd show black against the snow, and at the worst of the high turns, the place called the throat, where the haulers most often went off the edge in a whiteout, he built a cairn taller than himself and set a lantern bracket on it so that any soul coming over the pass would see, from a long way off in the worst weather, that the hollow was lit and held and waiting. He made the trail louder. He made it harder to let die quietly. I went with him. The pups went with him. And this is where the second thread of the story, the one the keepers got the most wrong, began to twist together with the first, because we did not walk beside him like dogs. We worked. I do not know how to make a man's kind understand this without it sounding like one of the keeper's tales, but it is the plain truth. An old man cannot reset a trail in 3 days in the deep cold with a bad hip. It is too much trail and too little man, and so we did the parts he could not. The pups, light and quick, ran ahead and found the buried markers under the drifts by scent. Harn had handled every one of those stakes for 40 years, and his smell was soaked into the wood, and the female could find a Harn-smelling stake under 2 feet of snow the way she found the bread he tossed. And they dug them clear and stood by them, marking them, until he came slow behind and reset them, and I carried the pitch pot in my jaws by its wire bail. I carried the cairn stones, one at a time in my mouth up to the throat, so the old man did not have to bend his bad hip to the ground for each one. I carried his pack when the climb got steep, the straps of it hooked over my withers, and I broke the trail ahead of him through the deep drifts so that he walked in a packed lane and not in snow to his thighs. We worked the high trail together, a half-blind old man and 3 drennhounds for 2 days, and we got it done. Every marker set, every blaze black and clear, the great cairn at the throat standing with its lantern lit so the pass could see. The hollow was held, and the haulers saw. That is the part that mattered in the end more than the gun. On the morning of the 3rd day, while we were finishing the last of the high blazes, a hauler train came over the pass. 3 crawler sleds heavy with river goods, frost-rimed, half a day overdue, a driver and his sons aboard who had nearly turned back in the night and had come on only because they'd seen, far off through the blowing snow, the lit cairn at the throat and known the hollow's fire was still keeping. They came down into the yard out of the white, and they were alive because the old man had made the trail louder, and they saw, every one of them saw, the keeper of Drennhollow at his work on the high trail with 3 grown drennhounds, the monsters of the valley, carrying his stones and breaking his trail and standing guard at his back. The driver was an old hand named Brevik, who had crossed that pass 200 times and known Harn 30 years, and he stood in the yard with his sons crowded behind him, and he watched the female pup trot up to Harn and drop a cairn stone at his feet and look up for the next, and he took off his fur cap in the cold, the way his kind does to mark a thing it cannot otherwise account for, and he said, "Harn, in the name of every cold god there is, what have you done up here?" "Kept the fire," Harn said. He took the stone the pup had brought, and he did not even look down at her, just rested his free hand on her head, the way a man rests his hand on a thing he has stopped noticing because it is always there. Same as always. "That's drennhounds," Brevik said. "They know it," Harn said. "Come in. There's heat and there's broth. You'll have run it close." Coming over in that, they came in. They sat at his fire, and we lay along the walls of the yard in the firelight in plain sight, while the hauler and his sons drank the old man's broth and could not stop looking at us. And somewhere in the second hour, the youngest son, a boy of maybe 10, slid down off the bench and crossed the floor on his knees, slow, the way a young thing crosses to another young thing, and put out one bare hand to the female pup, and Harn said low, "Easy. Let her smell you first," and the boy held his hand still, and the pup smelled it. And then she put her great iron-gray head down into the boy's small lap and sighed, and the whole room let out a breath it had been holding for 9 generations. That is the night the warm ration law truly began to travel, though no one in that room had a name for it yet. The hauler Brevik went down off the high trail 2 days later, when the weather broke, and he carried the story down with him into the river town the way a hauler carries everything. And the story he told was not the mad old man is, feeding monsters. The story he told, in the trade houses and the broth halls along the river, with his sons there to swear to it, was this: that the keeper at Drennhollow had made peace with the drennhounds of the High Valley, that they kept the trail with him now, that they had carried the stones of the cairn that saved his train, that a grown sire had lain along the wall of the hollow all night and not so much as bared a tooth at his boys, and that the coil outfit had been up there 3 days past, meaning to close the fire and put the old man on a wagon and burn the whole thing for hides. A strong thing's power is in not being seen doing the cruel part. Harn had made the hollow into a place where the cruel part would be seen. He had made witnesses. He had made the female pup put her head in a boy's lap in front of a man who would tell it in 200 broth halls. And the syndicate, when they came back, and they came back on the morning of the 4th day, because their kind cannot let a challenge stand any more than mine can, found that the ground had shifted under their fine collars while they were down in the warm, and that the old man they had come to brush off the trail had spent his 3 days not packing, but turning the whole high country into an audience. The syndicate did not stay quiet the whole 3 days, and I would be lying to leave the middle of it out, because the worst of what they tried came in those days between the first sled and the last, and it came not with guns, but with the small cold cruelties of a strong thing that has decided to wear a weaker thing down before it crushes it. On the night after Vec's first visit, a single crawler came partway up the trail in the dark and stopped below the throat, out of sight of the hollow's fire, and a man got off it and went to work on the old man's water. I scented him before the pups did, a stranger smell coming up the trail in the wrong hours, and I went down through the rocks, low and silent, and found him crouched at the place where the spring came out of the mountain to feed Harn's well, the only unfrozen water on the high trail, and he had a sack with him, and in the sack was the kind of fouling a man uses to poison a beast range. A slow, bitter salt that does not kill outright but sickens, that turns a well sour for a season, that would have left an old keeper with no water he could drink, and no broth to give the haulers, and no choice, by the dead of winter, but to come down meek on their wagon after all. I did not kill him. I want that kept, because it would have been easy, and because the old man's whole long lesson was in what I did instead. I came up out of the dark behind him, and I let him feel the breath of me on his neck before he knew I was there, and when he spun with his heart in his throat, I took the sack, only the sack, in my jaws, from his hands. And I stood and let him see the size of me in the starlight and what one closing of my jaws would do, and then I turned and carried his poison sack away up the rocks, and he ran. He ran the whole way back to his crawler and down the trail in the dark, and the well stayed sweet, and in the morning, I laid the sack on the feeding stone for the old man to find. The way the pups laid things there, the way we laid everything we wanted, understood. Harn understood. He opened the sack and smelled the bitter salt, and his old face went hard in a way I had not seen it. "Sore salt," he said. "They meant to foul my water." He looked up the trail toward the pass, toward the river town far below it, and then he looked at me, and he said a thing I did not have the words for then, but have kept since. "They can't win it clean, so they mean to win it dirty and quiet. Foul the well, starve me out, write it as the old fool who couldn't keep his own water." He shook his head. "Slow. No, we make it loud. Everything they try to do quiet, we make loud." That was the day he went up to reset the trail markers and paint the blazes black and build the great cairn at the throat. The day he turned the whole high country into witnesses. And I understand now that it was the poison sack on his feeding stone that decided him, that showed him the shape of how they meant to do it and gave him the shape of how to stop it. There was a thing the male pup did in the middle of those days that I have never told straight and that the keepers would have ruined if they'd had it, so I keep it close and give it only here. The male, the quieter of the two, the one who let his sister go first at the bread and the fire, had taken that winter to walking the old man's bad side. Not his good side, where the eyes still half worked. His bad side, the left, where the hip dragged and the world went dim, where a stumble in the dark would put an old man down in the cold for good. The pup had learned, without a single word from anyone, that the keeper was weak on the left, and he had appointed himself to that weakness, and he walked it. When Harn went out to the well in the black mornings, the male was at his left hip, a warm iron-gray wall between the old man and the long fall down to the storehouse steps. When Harn climbed to the cairn, the pup climbed below him on the left, where a slip would land, so that if the old man went down, he would go down onto a pup and not onto stone. He never made a sound about it. He never asked to be thanked. He had simply looked at the den's keeper, found the place where the cold could take him, and put his own body there. The strong covering the weak, the circle widened in the one direction the old man could not cover himself. And on the morning Harn nearly did go down, a patch of glazing ice below the cairn, his bad hip folding, his weight already gone. It was the male who was there, exactly there, who took the old man's falling weight against his shoulder and held, braced, until the keeper found his feet again. Harn stood a long moment with his hand buried in the pup's iron coat, breathing white, and then he said, low, only to him, good lad, that is all. No doctrine. A pup who had decided the keeper's weak side was his post and held it, and an old man who knew at the end of his life that he would not fall alone. He kept that post for 11 winters after, the male did, on the bad left side, through every climb to the cairn and every black morning at the well, and he never once let the old man go down. And when the keepers came years later and saw the great silver beast walking always at Harn's dim side, and asked what it meant, the old man only said it meant the cold had a harder time finding him now, and would say no more, because some things a man's keeps for himself, and the one who held them with him. They tried twice more in those 3 days. Once they sent word up by a frightened hauler, a real hauler, an honest one, made to carry a company message against his will, that the closing was lawful and that any man who aided the keeper would lose his trade license on the river, a threat meant to strip Harn of help and leaves him alone on the high trail with no one to witness anything. And once, on the last night before they came back in force, they tried the cruelest small thing of all. They came up in the dark, and they took the lantern from the cairn at the throat, climbed the cairn we had built and lifted out the burning lantern and carried it off, so that the pass would go dark, so that any hauler coming over in the night would find no light and no held fire, and might go off the edge at the throat in the white. And the old man in the morning would be the keeper whose darkened trail killed a hauler, the final proof that he was too old and too soft and too dangerous to keep the fire. But the female pup had taken to sleeping at the cairn. She had decided, in the way she decided things, that the great stone heap we had built at the throat was the most important thing in the den's whole range, for the old man tended it most carefully, lit its lantern with his own hands, climbed all that bad-hipped way to see to it. And so she had appointed herself, without being asked, its keeper, and she lay at the foot of it through the cold nights with the lantern light on her iron-gray coat. And when the men came in the dark to lift the lantern out and carry the light away, they found a grown drennhound rising up out of the snow at the foot of the cairn, silent, hackled between them and the flame. They did not get the lantern. They did not get within a body length of it. She did not even have to bite. She only had to be there, all of her, in the dark, between the men and the light. And the men remembered, suddenly and completely, what kind of valley they were standing in after dark, and they went back down the trail with their hands empty and the light still burning behind them at the top of the world. She kept the fire. A half-grown pup, who one winter before had been dying in a den of ice, kept the light of the high pass burning against men who came to put it out, not because anyone told her to, but because she had watched an old man tend that light with such care that she had decided it was the heart of the den, and a thing that is the heart of the den you keep, that is the whole of it. That is what they built the temple on. The keepers carved her into the courtyard stone as a sacred guardian of the eternal flame and put a doctrine in her mouth, and it was none of that. It was a young creature who loved an old man and had learned from him, without a single shared word, the one law that turned out to matter most. You keep the fire lit, for whoever comes cold up the trail in the dark. You keep it lit and you do not let anything put it out. So when the 8 came back at dawn on the 4th day, with their guns and their cruel hunter and their report already written in their heads, they came up a trail they thought belonged to them, and every stone of it had been reset by the old man and guarded by his pack, Every blaze on the rocks was black and clear. The great cairn at the throat still burned, the well still ran sweet, and the hollow's fire was lit and held and full of witnesses who had come up cold in the night and found the light still keeping. They had spent 3 days trying to put the fire out quiet, and every quiet thing they tried, the old man and his monsters had made loud. And now there was nothing left to do but the loud thing itself, in the open, in front of all the witnesses they had tried so hard to prevent. And that was the one thing in the world the Coil outfit could not afford to do. The hunter did it anyway. Cruelty in the end is not a clever thing. It is only a strong thing that has run out of quiet. And so he climbed down off his sled in the gray dawn light with his long gun in his hands, and he raised it toward the high rocks, where my pups and I lay watching. And what happened next, I have already told you, and the keepers have already carved, and only the bones of it are true. They came back with 8, not 4, and the hard-faced man with the long gun was at the front of them. And I knew before they were off the sleds that this time they had not come to talk. I smelled it on the wind a long way down the trail, the cold oiled smell of more guns than men need for talking, and under it the particular sourness of the hard-faced man, who had been shown rich prey, forbidden it, and had spent 4 days letting that curdle. He had brought friends of the same make. Vec was with them in his fine collar, but he rode at the back of the second sled now, and his soft hands were folded in his lap, and I understood that the shape of the day had been handed from the clever coward to the cruel hunter, and that Vec meant to let the hunter do the part he did not want his own name on. They had come up early, in the gray before true light, to do the cruel thing while the trail was empty and there were no haulers to see. But the trail was not empty. The old man had made witnesses, and not all of them had gone down the river. Brevik the hauler was still at the hollow. His train had been weathered in 2 more days by a blow over the pass, and he and his sons had spent them in the storehouse, and they were there in the gray morning when the sleds came grinding up out of the dark. And so were 2 other trail folk who had come in off the high country in the night and found the fire lit and stopped, the way folk had stopped at Harn's fire for 40 years. 9 men of the trail, all told, woke in the storehouse to the sound of company engines and came out into the yard behind the old keeper and stood. They had no guns to speak of, a hauler's short piece, a skinning knife, an axe, but they had eyes. They had the thing the syndicate most did not want. They had witnesses who had drunk the old man's broth and watched a monster lay its head in a boy. S-lap, I took the high rocks again with the pups. This is what I am for. A wall in the open is for talking. A thing in the high rocks is for when the talking is done. Harn knew it. He did not call us down this time. He left us where the killing could come from above and behind, and he walked out alone on his bad hip with the long gun across his back, and he stood in front of his fire and his witnesses and waited for the hunter to climb down off the sled. You were told 3 days, the hard-faced man said. He had his long gun in his hands, not slung now, and 7 men behind him with theirs, and the cold light coming up gray on all that oiled metal. It's been 4. The hollow's closed, old man. By charter, we're here to see it dark. His eyes went up the rocks, found us, the 3 pale-eyed shapes against the stone, just as before, and his mouth did a small, ugly thing. And we're here to settle the stock-loss bounty while we're at it. Coats like that don't come down off the high range twice in a man's life. There's haulers behind me, Harn said. There's witnesses. You fire a gun in this yard, it gets told in the river town with names on it. Witnesses, the hunter smiled. Witnesses to a mad old man who'd gone so soft he was feeding stock killers and got himself killed for it when they finally turned. That's the report, keeper. That's the only report there's going to be. A drennhound pair turns on the man fool enough to feed it. Sad, but everyone said it would happen. Nobody in any town will blink. He worked the action of the long gun, a hard cold sound in the cold air. Stand aside or don't. Makes no difference to the report which way you fall. And there it was, plain at last, their whole plan said aloud. They would kill us, the pups, me, and they would kill the old man. And they would write it so that the killing of the man was our doing, a beast turning on its keeper, and the killing of us was the just and necessary end of dangerous vermin, and the closing of the hollow was the sad cleanup after a foolish old man's death. One report, and every cruel thing they had come to do would wear the face of a tragedy that had nothing to do with them. A strong thing's power is in not being seen doing the cruel part, and the hunter thought he had found the way to do it in the open and still not be seen. He had made one error. He thought the report would be written by the living. He raised the long gun toward the rocks, toward the pups, toward the female who was the nearest pale shape, who had laid her head in a boy's lap, who had dragged a winter's larder onto a stone to feed an old man she had decided was hers. He raised the gun to take her coat off her body in front of the keeper who loved her, and he meant for that to be the first shot, the one that broke the old man's heart before it broke his body. I came off the rocks before the gun was level. I will not pretend to a man's kind account of it. of seconds and distances, because that is not how it is from inside. From inside it is one thing. The hunter is below the line that says mine, and his gun is rising toward the small one I carried marrow uphill to keep alive, and the whole of me that is apex and sire and 9 generations of the most dangerous thing in the valley becomes a single closing fact. I do not remember the snow. I remember the gun barrel and then the man's arm and then the warm shock of my jaws closing, not on his throat, on his arm, on the arm that held the gun. I had chosen in the long fall down the rocks the same way I had chosen everything that winter. I took the arm and not the life, because the old man had spent a whole season teaching me without a single word that we shared that you can win the thing and leave the killing on the ground, that the circle is widened, not closed. The gun went into the snow. The man went under me, screaming, his arm ruined but his life in it, and I stood over him with my jaws an inch from his face and let him understand, in the oldest language there is, the language that needs no words and crosses every kind, exactly how thin the margin was between the arm and the throat and exactly who had chosen which. The yard had gone to chaos and then fast to stillness. The pups were down off the rocks and into the men, not biting, herding the way they had learned to herd the markers, cutting between the gunman and the old man, iron gray and silent and everywhere, and the 7 hunters found themselves in a yard suddenly full of grown drennhounds moving like one cold thing, and not one of them got a shot off, because not one of them could find, in that whirl of fang and witness and their own screaming leader, a single moment that was not already too late. And the haulers and the trail folk had come up behind with their axe and their knife and their short piece, 9 of them, witnesses become a wall, and the gray light came up full over a yard where the coil outfit's 8 had become 8 men frozen in a circle of teeth they could not shoot, their way out of without dying for it in front of witnesses who would carry every name down the river. Easy, Harn said. He said it to me, one word, low, the same word he'd used the first night to tell a starving monster to slow down, or it would cramp, the same private gravel. And I felt it land in me and hold. I had the hunter's face an inch from my jaws, and the killing was right there, clean and clear and owed, and the old man said easy and I held. I want the keepers to hear this, the ones who carved the stone. They wrote it as obedience. It was not obedience. I have never obeyed anything in my life. What it was, the only word I have that fits, is trust. I held because across one winter the old man had never once been wrong about which things to let die and which to let live, and standing over the hunter with the man's heartbeat in my ears, I trusted his judgment over my own hunger, the way he had trusted his fire over his fear. That is a thing stronger than obedience and stranger than love, and they have no word for it either, and they built a temple trying to say it and got it wrong, and only I am left who had it from inside. And then the pack moved, and the keepers never carved this part because no man told them of it, but I felt it from the center of it, and I will set it down. The female came out of the whirl of the herding and crossed the trampled snow, slow, deliberate, past the disarmed men and past her helper brother, and she went to the back sled where Vex sat frozen in his fine collar, and she rose up on her hind legs with her forepaws on the sled's cold rail, and she put her great iron-gray face level with his, an arm's length from his soft city eyes, and she did not snarl. She only looked at him, steady, the way the old man looked at a thing he had been expecting. And Vec, the clever coward who had wrapped a theft in a kindness and sent the cruel hunter to do the part he would not put his own name on, looked into the eyes of the pup he had come to skin for the price of her coat, and he understood, in the oldest language there is, the one that crosses every kind, that she had chosen, just as I had chosen, exactly how thin the margin was, and that the choosing was hers and not his, and never had been his and never would be again. The water came up in his soft eyes. He could not hold her look. He turned his fine face away from a half-grown beast on the rail of his own sled, and that was the moment the coil outfit lost the high trail. Not when I took the hunter's arm, but when a pup they had priced for hides looked their clever factor in the eye and made him be the one to look away. You'll get up, Harn told the hunter, slow, and you'll leave the gun. All of you'll leave the guns. And you'll go back down and tell your factor the hollows held. Held by the keeper and his pack, in front of 9 witnesses, and the next outfit that comes up this trail to put the fire out had better come ready to be remembered for it. He looked then past the men to the back sled, where Vex sat in his fine collar with his soft hands folded and his face the gray of old ash. You hear me, Factor? Your name's in it now. Whatever your report says. There's 9 men here who'll say what they saw, and what they saw was the coil outfit come up at dawn to murder an old man and skin his pack and write it as an accident. You can't close this fire quiet anymore. I made sure of that. Now get off my ground. They got off his ground. It is a small, dull thing. The way it actually ended, not a slaughter, not a last stand, just 8 men picking themselves up out of the snow and leaving their guns in a heap, and climbing back onto cold sleds under the eyes of teeth and witnesses, and going back down the trail into the gray. The hunter went last, cradling his ruined arm, and at the lip of the yard he turned and looked back once at me standing over the heap of guns with the pups ranged at my flanks, and there was no more cruelty in his face. There was only the thing I had come to the hollow looking for, that first starved night, and never found in the old man. There was fear, proper fear. The fear of prey that has finally understood what it stood in front of. He had come up the high trail to take coats off, grown drennhounds, and Rite us as vermin, and he went back down having learned in his own flesh exactly where on the food chain he and his outfit actually stood, which was wherever the old man at Dren Hollow decided to put them. That is the antagonist and the keepers do tell, more or less right, because it is the kind of end their doctrine likes. The cruel hunter, humbled, the fine factor gone the color of ash, the closing charter come up the trail with 8 guns and gone back down with none, beaten not by a stronger gun but by an old man who had made himself too witness to murder. The Coil outfit did not come back. They could not afford to. Brevik and his sons and the trail folk carried it down exactly as Harn had built it to carry, names and all, and by the time the weather broke for good, the story was the length of the river, and no factor in any outfit wanted his name on the next chapter of it. The automated beacon and the warm cot in the almshouse were quietly forgotten. The charter, it turned out, had a great deal of trouble being enforced against a public way that the whole high country had decided it loved. The hollow stayed lit. The old man kept his fire. But that is not the end of the story, and the keepers are wrong to make it so. Because they ended on the men, and the story was never really about the men. The men were weather. The story was about the fire, and who tends it, and what it costs. And that part went on a long time after the last sled went down the trail. Harn kept the fire 11 more winters. I was there for all of them. The pups grew. This is the part the keepers leave out entirely, because it does not fit a doctrine carved in stone, but it is the truest part, and I will set it down plain. Cubs do not stay cubs. The female who dragged the larder onto the feeding stone grew, across those winters, into a sire's equal of a beast, taller at the shoulder than I had ever stood, iron gray going to silver at the muzzle the way mine had, and she took a mate from a pack 2 valleys over and brought him to the hollow, and they whelped in the warm storehouse with the old man's blessing. And there were pups in the yard again, and then pups of those pups. The hollow became a den, not a man's house with monsters tolerated in the yard, a den with an old man at the heart of it, who fed the weak first and widened the circle, and never once in 11 years raised an iron to any of us, and whom we kept the way we keep our own. Absolutely, and without being asked, and we kept the fire with him. Every winter the trail work, the markers, the blazes, the great cairn at the throat with its lantern lit for the pass to see. The haulers came to expect us. A train would come over the gap half dead in a white out, and find the hollow's fire lit in a half circle of grown drennhounds lying along the yard, walls in the firelight, and the driver stopped being afraid of it within a year or two, and within 5 it was a thing they told their children about wanting to see. The keeper of Dren Hollow and his pack, the old man who had made peace with the monsters of the high valley, the warm fire at the top of the world where the beasts carried the stones. The keepers, the trail keepers guild, the down valley folk who tend the lesser fires along the river, they came up in the later years to see it for themselves because the story had got too large to leave alone. And they watched the old man feed us, watched him set the meat on the flat stone in the firelight, and step back and let the hungry ones eat in peace, the strong waiting on the weak, the circle wide. And being keepers, being the kind of people who cannot see a plain thing without building a temple on it, they wrote it down as a rite. They called it the warm ration law. They decided it was ancient, that it had come down from the deep cold of the first winters, that the drennhounds had always known it, and the old man had merely been the one to remember it back into the world. They built, on the river, a trail temple with a feeding stone in the courtyard, and they carved the law into it, and on the longest night of every year they hold a procession where grown drennhounds, for it spread the peace. It spread down every cold valley on the range, and then off the range entirely to the cold worlds, wherever men keep fires against the dark, where grown drennhounds lay meat at the keeper's feet on the feeding stone, and the keepers lay meat back, and everyone weeps and calls it the oldest bond there is. It is not the oldest bond there is. It is younger than I am. I watched it begin. It began with a tired old man too stubborn to be afraid, who would rather share a smaller supper with the monsters in his yard than eat a larger one, alone, and a starved sire who could not understand why the meat was not poisoned, and a foolish pup who saw an old man feed the hungry and decided that must be what one does for one's own. That is the whole of the warm ration law. There is no doctrine in it. There is only a fire and a stone and the choice, made fresh every cold night by something with the strength to choose otherwise. to widen the circle instead of closing it. I will tell you how it ended, because I was the only one of his pack who was there at the true end, and the keepers were not, and they tell that part worst of all. He did not die in the cold, and that is the mercy I would have asked for him if I had been a thing that could ask. The 11th winter was a soft one, as the high country goes, and the old man was very old by then, older than any keeper before him had managed at that altitude. Kept alive past his time, I have come to believe, by the simple fact of having a den that needed tending and a fire that did not care if his hip hurt. He had gone all the way gray, gone nearly blind in truth now and not just in the dark, and he moved through the hollow more by memory and by the warm shapes of us than by his eyes. But he kept the fire. Every night, the meat on the stone. Every night the circle widened. He did not miss a night in 11 years, and he did not miss this one. It was on the longest night that he went, which the keepers have made much of, calling it fitting, calling it chosen, and perhaps it was, though not in the way they mean. The longest night is the coldest, and the most fires are lit against it, and the most travelers are out on the trails trusting those fires to hold. And an old keeper on the longest night does not rest. He had been out at the cairn at the throat at dusk, with me beside him as I had been beside him for 11 years, breaking his trail and carrying his pitch, and he had lit the great lantern with his own stiff hands so the pass could see the hollow was held. On the way down, in the blue dark, with the lantern burning behind us at the top of the world, he stopped and put his hand on my shoulder, heavier than he meant it, and he said, "Easy now." He had said that word to me 10,000 times. The first night, to slow a starving thing down. In the yard, to hold my jaws off a hunter's throat. Across 11 winters, to settle a whelp or quiet a growl, or simply to mark, in passing, that all was well and I could stand down. Easy now. It was the oldest word between us, older than my name. The word that built the trust, that built the den, that built everything the keepers later carved in stone. And he said it that last time on the trail down from the throat, with his hand going heavy on my shoulder, and his old heart, I think, already beginning to stop. And I understood, the way I had learned across a lifetime to understand the shape of his meaning before I had his words, that this time the easy was not for me. It was for him. He was telling himself. He was telling the cold. He was easing down the way he had told me to ease down 1,000 times, and he wanted at the end to do it the way he had taught me. Slow, unafraid, the circle held. I got him home. I will not tell that part long. He could not walk the last of it, and I am Vale. And a grown sire of my kind can carry a man's weight a long way through deep snow when there is reason, and there was reason. I brought him down off the high trail to his own fire, to the warm storehouse den full of his pack, and the female, silver-muzzled now herself, a grandmother of drennhounds, met us at the door and understood at once the way we understand, and the whole den drew in close and warm around the old man, where I laid him by the fire he had kept for 51 years. He did not say anything more. There was nothing more the word easy had not already said. He lay by his fire in the heart of his den with the pack pressed warm against him on every side, the strong giving their warmth to the weak now. The circle closed all the way around him at the last, not to shut anything out but to hold the warmth in, and somewhere in the deep of the longest night his old heart finished its easing, and the keeper of Drennhollow went under, the way his partner had gone under the ice all those years before. But not cold, and not alone. Never that, we saw to that. It was the one thing, in the end, we could carry for him. We buried him behind the storehouse, in the one soft patch of ground, beside the partner he had pulled from the ice and never spoken of. The trail folk did the digging when the thaw came, but it was the pack that kept the watch over the turned earth all that spring, and it is the pack that keeps it still. For the hollow's fire never went dark. The female took it up. She had watched him keep it for 11 years the way she had once watched him feed a starving stranger, and she did with the fire what she had done with the larder all those winters ago. She saw the shape of the thing he did, and she did it. The haulers came over the pass that next winter half expecting the dark, and found the hollow's fire lit, and the great cairn at the throat burning, and a half circle of drennhounds along the yard walls in the firelight, and a flat feeding stone by the door with meat on it, set out fresh, the strong waiting on the weak, the circle wide. So the keepers are wrong about that too when they tell it. They say the bond ended with the old man, and was made eternal in the temple and the stone and the longest night procession. But the bond did not end with the old man, and it does not live in the temple. It lives where it always lived, at the fire, on the trail, on the longest night, in the choice made fresh by something strong enough to choose otherwise, to widen the circle instead of closing it. The hollow's fire is lit tonight. I know, because I am old now, silver to the bone, the last who was there at the first night and the last night both, and I have come up the high trail one more time, slow now, my own hip gone bad the way his did, to lie by the fire my pack keeps in the old man's place and tell this true before I ease down myself. They will carve something on a stone about me too, I expect, when I am gone. Ashthroat they will call me, who came down off the White Ridge to kill the keeper and stayed 11 years to carry his stones. They will make it a doctrine. They cannot help it. But you who hear this, you keep the plain thing the way I have kept it. It was never a rite, and it was never ancient, and it was never about the monster learning to love the man. It was about a man who looked at the most dangerous thing in the valley, starved and murderous in his yard in the killing cold, and was too tired and too stubborn and too unalonable to be afraid of it, and who set out a stone and put meat on it and stepped back and said, over his shoulder on his way to a bed he did not have to share, "Come in or don't. I'm not heating the whole valley for your manners." That was the door. That was the whole of it. He held it open, and he never once closed it. Not on me, not on the pups, not on the haulers half dead off the pass, not on anything that came cold to his fire across 51 winters. And a thing that should have killed him walked through it instead and learned slow across a lifetime that the strongest thing in any valley is not the one with the longest teeth. It is the one who shares the fire. Easy. Now, the night is long, and the stone is set, and the circle is wide, and the hollow is lit. It is held.